Okay, so let's get underway. This is SpaceX's Starship rocket system for sending astronauts to the moon and then on to Mars. And as you can see, it's quite a size there. It's 120 meters high, or 25 stories. This is the Starship that they'll be sending the astronauts in, and this is the super heavy booster to put it into orbit. So let's put this baby up there.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff.
That really is something, huh? We're going to see more of that. And usually within about 8 to 10 minutes, you're in Earth orbit, you're weightless, and preparing for the launch to head out to Mars. NASA and SpaceX are aiming to get astronauts to Mars by 2040. But between now and then, we've got to work on a lot of challenges. That whole journey is going to create a whole stack of challenges to the entire body and the mind. That's why today's talk is the hazards of human spaceflight to Mars, aka long duration spaceflight, and things we need to know. And I will conclude and address the question, will travel be safe by 2040? Okay, so as I mentioned, it affects the whole body and the mind. So for time purposes, today's talk, I'm focusing on 3 physical challenges. The first 2 effects on the cardiovascular system, that's the heart and blood vessels and fluids, and the musculoskeletal, that's the bones and the muscles of the body. They are affected by prolonged weightlessness. We take for granted that constant downward pull on us, and our bodies rely on that to function. So we're going to learn about that, and then we'll talk about radiation. What you can't see. You can see astronauts being weightless. You can't see radiation. It's lethal. So let's look at the cardiovascular system. As mentioned, that refers to the heart, the blood vessels, and all the body fluids. There are 4 main changes, which we'll just address each of these, and then we'll talk about some of the research that's been going on, and then the countermeasures, the proposed countermeasures. The bottom line is, you don't want an astronaut reaching Mars weak and unconditioned. You want them to be in top physical form. So let's look at each one. So it's blood volume shift and reduction. We'll talk about how astronauts get anemic. We'll talk about how the heart reduces in size and its ability to function, aerobic capacity. And then we'll talk about what the astronauts, what they experience when they come back to Earth, but we've got to think, hey, when they get to Mars, under the influence of gravity. So here's a picture there of Scott Kelly and Mikhail Korneyev. There were 2 astronauts, American and Russian, who were on the International Space Station as part of a 1-year study. They were both up in space for 1 year. And have a look at them here. They look like ordinary guys, don't they? Nice jawline, normal chin, normal neck creases, same here, neck creases, chin, and your jawline. Let's put these guys in space. Yeah, quite a difference. Notice, the chins are puffed out, they've lost their jawline, their necks are all puffed out. Look at their upper torsos, all bloated. And so that change happens very quickly in space. So in the first 6 to 12 hours of being in space, 2 liters of fluid moves headward. Gravity tends to pull our fluid down into our lower part of our body, more legward, but suddenly it's allowed, without gravity, it's allowed to float upwards. So 2 liters of fluid within the blood system moves up, also within the tissues as well. And it gives that puffy face, nasal congestion, altered taste, like you've got sort of hay fever or a bad head cold. You know how miserable you feel with a bad head cold? Well, us guys know about it anyway, how miserable we feel. Man flu. So, yeah, you feel miserable, don't you? So they all report that. It's not a pleasant sensation in the first instance. Then within 1 to 2 days, up to 1 litre of fluid within your blood system seeps out into all your tissues. So that's adding to astronauts that get really bloated, and also naturally you're losing 1 litre of fluid. The blood system is about 5 litres on average, so you're losing a fifth of that, 20%. Your blood pressure drops, so suddenly you've got a bloated astronaut with a low blood pressure. Once again, all this is fine. This is just the body's adaptation to being in space. They can function perfectly well in space like this. It's all about when you get back to Earth or when you arrive at Mars, and you're going to need to function. Astronauts get anemic, and you might say, well, you've just told me they lose 1 litre of fluid from the blood system into their tissues. Surely their red cell concentration, the hemoglobin or red blood cell, if you will, that carries oxygen, surely that must be higher concentration. How can they be anemic? And it all comes down to there's a compensatory mechanism in the body, in the kidneys, whereby the kidneys monitor your blood count, and in particular they monitor the oxygen saturation and tension in the blood. And if you happen to be anemic and the kidneys pick up there's less oxygen in the system, it produces a hormone called erythropoietin. That hormone then goes and stimulates the bone marrow. Hey, produce more red blood cells, thank you very much. So here you've got these astronauts, they've lost 1 litre of blood fluid into the tissue. The kidneys pick up, hey, everything's a bit concentrated here. We've got more red cells than we really need concentration-wise. So what does it do? It dampens down or switches off the erythropoietin level, so the bone marrow gets less, if any, stimulation to produce their red cells. They get anemic. The other thing that happens with the heart. The heart gets smaller and it gets spherical. You've probably seen a picture of a heart. It's a pear shape. And the reason behind that is twofold. One has got gravity pulling the blood down into the lower chambers, the ventricles, so that's just natural. But also those lower chambers in your heart, your ventricles, they're the ones that have that mighty push, that mighty contraction to force blood up to the head and down into the body. And suddenly you're in space, you don't have that downward pull of gravity, so the heart adopts a spherical shape, which is a little bit less efficient. But also, you lose, because it's not having to work, what happens when you don't have to work your muscles? They get thin. You lose 10% of your heart muscles in space. The same occurs in arteries. You think, what are muscles doing in arteries? Arteries have muscles around them in a concentric fashion, and they squeeze and tight, and that maintains your blood pressure. And also in your legs, it keeps the blood from all pooling down there, and it just helps to distribute and keep an even blood pressure. So you've got an astronaut now who's deconditioned cardiac-wise. As mentioned, the importance of that is getting to Mars. You might say, oh, some good news, it returns to normal within a month. Yes. You get to Mars, you've got a lot of work to do. That's a long month that you're deconditioned. Then when the astronauts, and you've probably seen scenes like this before when astronauts get back to Earth, particularly after a long duration flight, they're very weak. They have trouble standing, and they often have to be picked up and carried in chairs. Their blood pressure is low, and they're feeling very, very dizzy because of that. After 2 weeks in space, just 2 weeks, that's not long, 2/3 of astronauts cannot stand for 10 minutes. After 3 months in space, and that's not long either, most of the astronauts these days are in space 6, 9, or 12 months. But after 3 months of space, 4 out of 5 astronauts have trouble standing for 10 minutes. So it is a problem. So once again, you get to Mars, you do not want to be weak and feeling dizzy with low blood pressure. So let's just have a look at some of the research that goes on. The astronauts really, they get prodded and poked and scanned before flights, during flights, and of course for set periods after their flights. They get MRI scans of their heart, ultrasound scans of their heart, pre-flight, post-flight, usually at 3, 6, and 12 months, assessing the changes in the shape of the heart from before pre-flight, the size of their hearts and the strength of their hearts. They're all wired to the hilt. You often don't see that, what's going on underneath their uniforms in space. But a lot of the time, a lot of the astronauts are wired to the hilt with electrocardiograms, ECGs, Holter monitors. That's a continuous recording of the rhythm of the heart. So that's all going on as well with a lot of the astronauts. They'll often wear a blood pressure cuff 24/7. Monitoring what happens to blood pressure. This is all part of the research program. What happens with their blood pressure when they're doing certain activities, when they're asleep, when they're doing research, when they're doing their exercises, and so on. All part of the research. If you don't like blood tests, don't go into space because you're going to get plenty of those done. And they're continuously monitoring electrolytes, that's sodium and potassium, kidney function, your basic blood count, that's your red cells, your white cells, your platelet for clotting and so on. They're constantly checking that. Your liver functions, checking hormone levels, checking bone markers. What's all biomarkers? What are they? They are proteins that the body produces that reflects if the heart is under strain, if you're getting excessive bone loss, if you're getting any blood clots in your system. All those pathological processes tend to produce their own little protein markers. So they monitor for all those as well. The astronauts are trained to do scans on each other's hearts and the arteries, particularly the carotid artery up in the neck. So they get that done on a regular basis in space as part of their research to see when, how their heart changes. And let's have a look at now countermeasures. So if you don't like exercise, space is not for you. They have 2 treadmills and they have an exercycle bike on the space station. And they're held down to mimic gravity and get some sort of resistance. They're held down, you can see it there. They have a harness, and you can see it here. The harness is strapped over their shoulders and around their waistline. And you can see it there too, just to hold them in place. They don't have a seat on the exercycle bike because you don't need one. They just put their harnesses on and just quietly cycle away. Treadmill, because there's no up or down in space. One of the treadmills, from the way they film it, it's actually on the wall. And you see an astronaut just quietly running just perpendicular to the wall. So they choose about 80, the harness creates about 85% of your body mass is the idea behind it, and your body weight. Anything more than that, and it becomes very uncomfortable for the astronauts. So they are running and they're cycling as if they're 85% of their body weight. You can see that's their program. They exercise between 2 and 2.5 hours per day, 6 days a week. A lot of the astronauts actually love it so much that they actually do it 7 days a week. So they don't have to, 6 days a week is sufficient. That is the program there that they do on the treadmill and the exercycle bike for cardiovascular purposes. I'll be talking about this too for bones and muscles, but that's their protocol there. 6 times a week, 30 to 45 minutes on the treadmill, and you ain't out of more exercise, and 3 times a week, 30 to 45 minutes on the cycle. This is an interesting contraption. Remember I mentioned that you get deconditioning of the artery muscles, and that's important to maintain a tone, and particularly in your legs where all the fluid wants to pull. And this contraption here is called the lower body negative pressure suit. And it's a Russian contraption, and it's where it seals itself around your waist. It's a complete, and then they create a vacuum. They suck all the air out in your trousers. So it brings the blood down. It tries to recondition the arteries. So they do that for 20 minutes per day on the last week of the mission. Try and recondition those arteries in the legs again. So the blood doesn't all pool down there when you get back to Earth. It's a bit of tone is built into the muscles. It is a bit clumsy. It always reminds me, who's seen Wallace and Gromit, The Wrong Trousers? Yeah, that's what it always reminds me of, The Wrong Trousers from Wallace and Gromit. And it is clumsy, it's attached to the wall. The Americans are working on a mobile version of it. But something else that the Americans are doing along that line is the American astronauts, when they come back, they wear this garment. It's a compression garment, and it's on a gradient, so higher pressure compression here and less as it goes up. And they put that on before re-entry. And that once again helps to stop blood pooling in the legs and keep it up in the upper torso and the head so they don't feel so weak and tired and lightheaded. The other thing they'll do, all the astronauts and cosmonauts do this, they have a litre of fluid, usually water or orange juice, with 8 salt tablets. Ugh, I know, I shudder at the thought. 8 salt tablets in a litre of fluid. And the idea behind it is, of course, with the salt, it keeps fluid in the system, so it increases your blood volume by about 400 mils. And they do that just before re-entry, usually about an hour or so pre-entry. If they do get stuck, the Americans do it, they'll often use them. There's medications you can use, that vasoconstrictors that tighten up the blood vessels, that will help. And sometimes they'll put a drip in and run 2 litres of intravenous fluids, usually some saline or something like that, and that will pick a lot of the astronauts up as well. But as you can see there, an astronaut being carried because he's too weak to stand. He cannot stand. Okay, so that's the cardiovascular system. Let's now look at the musculoskeletal, the bones and the muscles. What happens to them with prolonged weightlessness? There's 4 things I want to impart with the effects on the muscles and bones and prolonged weightlessness. Is changes are rapid, changes are significant, recovery is slow, but all of this is preventable. Bone loss, you're probably familiar with the term osteoporosis. It often happens to us with age. Our bones start to get a little bit thinner. Muscle wasting, or also known as muscle atrophy. Once again, if you're not using something we take for granted, the resistance of gravity, you start losing muscles as well. And just like you don't want an astronaut turning up weak and deconditioned on Mars, you don't want an astronaut turning up poor muscle strength, so they haven't got good balance and they're very weak on their pins, and also with brittle bones that are very vulnerable for a bone fracture. So you can just imagine the astronaut stepping off the ladder onto Mars, planting the flag, steps over the first rock, falls over and breaks his leg. Houston, we have a problem. Not a good look. So let's have a look at osteoporosis. And you don't need to be a radiologist to work out what's gone wrong with that bone. It's a broken leg. Astronauts on the moon, particularly the last 3 missions where they were more exploratory type of missions, which we'll talk about tomorrow, they had a lot of falls on the moon. The moon's gravity is about 1/6 that of Earth, and the Mars is twice the gravity. It's about 1/3 that of Earth. So the falls, they're going to have falls, and the falls are going to be a lot heavier than they were on the moon. And you might think, well, we have falls here and get up. These guys, remember, they're in pressurized spacesuits. You puncture a spacesuit, you're in trouble. But you don't want your bones being brittle either. So yeah, here's some interesting figures. This is without countermeasures. These are astronauts in their 30s and 40s, prime of their life. They lose 1.5% of their bone mass per month in space. Putting that in perspective, that's the equivalent that an 80 or 90-year-old person inactive in a rest home per year, they lose that amount of bone. These are astronauts in their 30s and 40s losing that per month. So it is significant. So over these longer stays, 9, 12 months, they can lose, because often it'll peak out, they can lose 10 to 20% of their bone mass. That's real brittle bones, prone to fracturing. As I mentioned, recovery rate is real slow. It can take 6 months to regain 60%, and it can take up to 1 to 2 years to fully regain your full strength. That's a long time when you're trying to colonize a new planet. Once again, this is all without intervention, of course. This is research from those earlier space missions. Prevention is the key. So let's look at bone loss countermeasures. As mentioned, they have 2 treadmills there. They exercise 2.5 hours per day. Cardiovascular fitness, as countermeasures, it's more focused on the aerobic. For the bones and the muscles, they put more emphasis on the resistance type of exercise. So the treadmill, they have 2 of those there, and there's the harness there, 85% loading. That creates some resistance in itself. But they have the ARAD, that's the Advanced Resistant Exercise Device. And it's like one of those multi-purpose muscle-type machines that people often, you see in the gyms and so on, and there it is there. And that works by a series of pistons and flywheel mechanisms where they can create resistance to almost every muscle group in the body. They can create as much resistance as they like. So they do a good workout on that as well. The other one for bones, vitamin D supplements and high calcium diet. We might take that for granted. Eat healthy and your bones and muscles will be fine. they don't have access to fresh vegetables and produce up in space. They don't have refrigerators and freezers where they can keep stuff. They rely on supply vehicles every 2 to 3 months. That's on the space station. And of course, when you're going to Mars, you're on your own there, kiddo. So you don't have supplies. So it is, up till now, their diets have been pretty much sort of dehydrated foods and bags that they've had to rehydrate and so on, and not the most appetizing and not the most nutritious. So that's a whole science of technology that they're getting better and better at keeping the astronauts with good nutrition and all their vitamins. Medications, there's a class of drug called bisphosphonates. And a lot of you may have heard of Fosamax. It's a tablet treated for osteoporosis called alendronate, and it's just one tablet once a week. And it's almost like painting cement on the bones. It really solidifies them up. Very, very effective. This is a classical case of, a lot of the times in science with research with space, it has spin-offs to medicine here on Earth. This is a classical case with something very commonly used on Earth. The astronauts are finding it really very, very helpful. Unfortunately, it has a side effect with some people. You can get a bit of gastric reflux with it. And in space, you don't have the downward pull of gravity, so you're more prone to reflux. So some of the studies, they've had to stop it. But there is an alternative, zolendronate, which is the same class of medication, but you give it to an intravenous infusion. Only takes about 15, 20 minutes. Your GP probably does it to plenty of people all day, every day. I've administered it dozens of times myself to people. That's easy to set up, and it's only every 18 months. So you hook your astronaut up before he flies to Mars, give him or her an infusion of zolendronate, and go to Mars, spend 500 odd days on Mars for the next window to come back, and you give them another infusion before they leave Mars. Bones protected. And I just want to put here some bone loss study results. They get bone density scans before flights and at various stages after flights, exact when they come home and at 6 to 12 months later. The ARAD exercise, that's the Advanced Resistant Exercise Device, just that alone, the data's they prevent a lot of bone mass loss, but it's not complete. Enter the bisphosphonates. Combined with the exercise, problem solved. No significant bone loss. In fact, some of the studies show the astronauts actually had increased bone density before they left. So that's really been a game changer, giving the astronauts, and there's nothing fancy about these medications, bisphosphonates. They're used every day on Earth by thousands of people. So that's the bone loss with osteoporosis. How about muscle wasting? And the importance of here, of course, is you need muscles to give you balance, give you strength. Weak muscles, you're more likely to go for a fall with those brittle bones. You can hold yourself steady, you're less likely to injure yourself. You might be able to break a fall a little bit easier. So it's very, very important to have good muscles. And muscles get very weak in space very quickly. 20% of their muscle mass can be lost. This is just 1 month in space. 20% of your muscle mass and a 30% drop in your muscle strength. That's huge. And that's just 1 month in space and weightlessness. So as I mentioned, that makes you very weak and prone to falls with brittle bones to boot. So there's a few further things that they can do here. So of course you've got your exercise that we've spoken about, and aerobic and resistance for the cardiovascular system and the bones. But there's a few other things for the muscles. In particular, one of them here is a penguin suit. It's like a jumpsuit. You can see here the astronaut. This is not compulsory, but the astronauts get handed it when they go into space. And it's got a series of elastic inserts and springs and pulleys. And it can create up to 40 kilograms of resistance per group of muscles, depending where you want to target. So that's very simple and very effective, as if you're just on Earth and always moving your arms and legs and your torso against some sort of constant resistance. Once again, with diet, we take it for granted, our diet, but diet and supplements have been shown in space to make a huge difference. Your amino acids, 30 grams of carbohydrate. Don't know what's going on there, never mind, it must be something to do with the leak. Yeah, that's just one banana. 30 grams of carbohydrates, just one banana, 3 times a day. Makes a huge difference. So that's very, very simple. Between resistance, optimal diet, and the supplements, just those alone give very, very good results with muscles. They're also doing some further research. You probably may have been to the physio, and you see the physio hook you up with electrodes, and they give you electric not shocks, that's too strong a word, but electric stimulation to muscles that seem to stimulate the muscles to regrow. They'll often do that after bad traumas and after strokes. It's a field of research. They're now starting to research that with astronauts as well, just electrical stimulation to their muscles, which keeps the muscles active and strengthened up. So that's prolonged weightlessness on the heart, the blood vessels, the body fluids, the bones, and the muscles. Let's have a look at radiation. And I've got a 6-page handout there. I already had a few of those on radiation. This has been one of my pet topics. So, of course, time-wise, we're only spending about 10 minutes on it here. But if you want a handout of that, and on my YouTube channel, I do a full 1-hour talk on this. So what is ionizing radiation? It refers to high-energy light, such as ultraviolet light, X-rays and gamma rays and so on, and high-speed charged particles full of energy that when they strike tissue, body tissue, in particular cells, in particular DNA, they damage, they break bonds, crucial bonds between chemicals and molecules in the body. And of course that upsets them, they can't work properly. So that will destroy, damage tissue. DNA, you can get errors or mutations in your DNA. And of course, we all know what that leads to, cancers is the big one there. So it can cause cancers, infertility, and just very illness in general. So that's what we mean by radioactivity. In particular, ionizing radiation refers to the high energy stuff, which I've just described, which bumps electrons off atoms and breaks up chemical bonds. Why is it a problem only in space, and why aren't we worried about this here? Is because on Earth here, as we talk, we are protected by the Earth's atmosphere, absorbs a lot of these particles and these high energy light from the sun, ultraviolet and gamma rays and X-rays. Our atmosphere absorbs that. And our magnetosphere. Magnetosphere refers to, because the Earth's got an iron molten core that slushes around, it creates electrical currents. And we've got electrical currents circling the globe, Earth like that. And it's called a magnetosphere because the magnetic currents around the sphere of the Earth. And once again, that deflects and it's able to absorb and protect us against a lot of charged particles as well. So that's why it's a problem in space, but not a problem on Earth. So where do they come from? There's 2 sources of radiation of concern to the astronauts. The first is the sun. The sun, as you're probably aware, gives out just a low flux, constant, just gentle low stream of charged particles. They're quite capable of doing harm. They're just coming from the sun all the time. They're not a problem. That's nothing that your spacesuit or the hull of your spacecraft doesn't take care of. That's not an issue. What is an issue with the sun is the sun, you've probably heard of it before, solar flares or coronal mass ejections. And that's where the sun goes through periods of increased activity where you get frequent solar flares, where you get a sudden burst of energy from the sun. You get release of X-rays, increased ultraviolet, but high energy charged particles. So it comes in intermittent bursts. The sun goes through 11-year cycles of being more active, and then it goes less active. Less active, you might get one of these events once a week. When it's more active, you might get 2 or 3 a day. Did you notice where all the auroras we've had in the last year or two? The sun's at its peak at the moment, called solar maximum, and it goes through an 11-year cycle. That's relevant for later on in the talk. So that is the big problem with the sun, these intermittent bursts. They call them solar particle events, or SPEs. The other one, which is of even more concern, is galactic cosmic rays. And that is a continuous, so instead of just being intermittent from one source, the sun, you've got it coming from all directions, all throughout the galaxy. Continuous flux of very, very high energy particles, large charged particles traveling close to the speed of light. What produces them? High energy events in the galaxy, such as supernova explosions and the like. So that's the biggie that does most of the damage and the difficulty from protecting the astronauts from. So let's have a look. So radiation, as I mentioned, it damages the crucial chemical bonds for molecules, which breaks down cell integrities and DNA and so on. So the effects can be acute or chronic. And in medicine, the word acute means something of sudden onset, short, sharp duration. Bang, it comes on and goes. And the word chronic means something that's a more insidious, slow onset with a long duration. As opposed to hear people say, oh, I had a chronic headache last night. And you go, really? The word chronic means something that comes on typically about sort of 6 to 8 weeks and more. So the acute radiation effects, they call it acute radiation syndrome, ARS, and it occurs over hours, a number of hours or a number of days. The big cause of this are the solar particle events, where you get that sudden burst. It typically affects the cells where there's a higher turnover in the body, gastrointestinal system, the GI tract. The cells are constantly turning over. So with that, the astronauts might get nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and hence they get very dehydrated and weak. That's if they were exposed to one of these unprotected. The bone marrow has a rapid turnover. It produces the red cells to keep your oxygen going, transporting, white cells for infection, platelet cells for clotting. So the bone marrow gets suppressed, so you get astronauts that are, once again, anemic. They'd be vulnerable to infection or bleeding. Central nervous system with exposure, sudden burst of high-dose radiation, confusion. Ataxia, that means unsteady on your feet. Probably like most students on a Friday night, or if there's a storm at sea, ataxia, convulsions, coma and death. So it's pretty important. So you don't want astronauts on their way to Mars getting very crook, very weak, very unwell and ineffective essentially. So that's the acute changes. How about chronic radiation changes? And this particularly is from those galactic cosmic rays. Just a constant low flux, but really high energetic stuff. And the effects take over months and years to form. Carcinogenic mutations, that's your DNA damage causing cancers. Cancers sometimes can take years to evolve and come out of the woodwork. Immunodeficiencies, so the immune system is suppressed, so you're more vulnerable to infections, more vulnerable once again for cancers. Coronary heart disease, that's hardening and narrowing of the arteries to the heart, is being linked with radiation. Infertility, you can't send up astronauts to try and colonize Mars when they all get up there. They're unwell and they're infertile. You're not going to do very well at sort of spreading the human race there. And of course, cataracts is another one too. So it results in an ineffective astronaut and poor health. Once again, I go into this in quite a bit more detail in the handout. So how much radiation, we're going to talk about countermeasures shortly, but first I want to talk about how much radiation does NASA feel that is acceptable for the astronauts. And they use the unit called CFERT, which is a unit that factors in your lifetime health effects from that ionizing radiation exposure. And it factors in types of radiation, the dose of radiation you've received, what sort of organs, because organs have different sensitivity, what organs have been affected. And from there, it's able to calculate. It's a computation process. They're able to calculate your risk of cancer. So they get given a CFERT recording. Put it in perspective, we're going to come to that example shortly. On Earth, we're exposed to about 3 millisieverts per year. It's just radioactive rocks here. The ground below us is radioactive. A few of those galactic cosmic rays just manage to get through the atmosphere. Food we eat, some of it's radioactive. Your bananas have radioactive potassium in them. So it's okay to eat a banana, it's very low. But my point being is just this low dose radiation around us all the time. We get exposed to about 3 millisieverts per year. Chest X-ray is about 1/10 of a millisievert. Okay, so the lifetime cancer risk is gender sensitive and it's age sensitive. Why? Gender sensitive, female astronauts, well, females are more vulnerable to radiation. You're probably aware breasts and ovaries are more vulnerable to radiation damage. But lung cancer, you wouldn't think so, but we don't know why, but it's just a biological fact. Women are more vulnerable to lung cancer than men. Who knows why? But we just know that. There's just statistics show that. But also breast and ovarian cancer. So women as a rule are more sensitive to radiation exposure. And the age, why? Because it's calculated your cancer risk over your lifetime. You get someone younger, they're going to live longer, so they've got more chances of developing a cancer, as opposed to an older person, they've got a shorter lifespan, so they're less likely to get that cancer. So let's get some examples going here. First of all, the limit. NASA sets it such that they draw the line if the calculations show that you have a greater than 3% increased lifetime risk of dying from a radiation-induced cancer with a 95% certainty. So as I mentioned, that whole thing, so it's not your absolute millisievert levels, it comes down to that computation of your increased risk of a radiation-induced cancer over your lifetime from radiation exposure. So, for example, a 30-year-old female, for example, Megan MacArthur, she was 29 when she was selected to be an astronaut. That 3%, 180 millisieverts, bang, as a rule, she's a lady, a woman in her 30s, early 30s, exposure of about 180 millisieverts, bang, she's reached a 3%. It's the end of her career. As opposed to a male such as Scott Kelly, he's now in his 60s, he flew in his 50s, but for argument's sake, a 60-year-old male can get up to 700 millisieverts before he's considered that threshold of that 3% risk. Now, putting that in perspective, the other thing I should mention here is NASA caps it at 600. Just because it might work out that he can quite happily go to 700, NASA actually caps it at 600. So putting it in perspective, as I mentioned, per year we're exposed to about 3 millisieverts. 1 year on the International Space Station is about 240 millisieverts on average. So you can see, for example, a young lady astronaut, 6 to 9 months on the space station. She's loving it. She's a career woman. Bang, that's the end of her career for flying anyway. So let's just put something else in perspective too, is that, so what habit going to Mars, because that's what we're talking about. The Curiosity rover, they had a radiation detected on that. They monitored the radiation going to Mars and then for a number of days on Mars. And they extrapolated it out. If you're going to go to Mars with a 500-day stay, travel there and back as well, you usually expose, the average exposure is about 1,000 millisieverts, or a 5.5% risk of developing a fatal radiation-induced cancer some stage in your life. So which is well above the 3%. But that's using today's current propulsion methods, 9 months each way, and at today's shielding technology. And I will show you shortly how that will not be a problem in the long term. Interesting enough, the astronauts, and this has been driven by the woman, not the men, it's been driven by the woman. They want to relax those limits, particularly on themselves. They're saying, hey, we are career women, we're pioneers, we know what we're doing, you've told us of the risk, thank you very much, but you let us decide how much radiation exposure and risk we're allowed. So there's a push for giving a limit of, say, 600 independent of sex or age. So that's in progress at the moment with the legal people, perhaps with signing a waiver. Let's look at some of the countermeasures. So first of all, it makes sense, shielding. And your craft, aluminium is the metal of choice for your spacecraft. People often say, oh, how about lead, how about lead? Lead stops X-rays, but it doesn't stop anything else. Lead's very soft and it's very heavy. It's not good to make spacecraft out of. Aluminium is the best. The thicker you go, up to about 30 grams per square centimetre, you get increased protection from there. But of course, it gets bigger and bulkier. So that they actually use they use 2 layers with some other layers in between. But needless to say, the hull of the spacecraft can drop that radiation exposure about 40 or 50%. Then there's water supply and polyethylene. What have these two things got in common? They're rich in hydrogen. Hydrogen is your ideal shielding for radiation. Why? Hydrogen is only one protein. It's the hydrogen, the nucleus is only one protein, which is positively charged. So it's got a high charge to mass ratio. Only one particle of hydrogen gives you a degree of protection to repel charged particles coming towards you. As I say, something bigger, carbon or whatever, that might have, its nucleus has got 12 subatomic particles, but only 6 of those is a proton, a positively charged proton, to repel. And you've got 6 neutrons. So hydrogen is your best. And there's a concept which I talk about in depth with the handout called secondary radiation. High charged particle hits a large particle in the hull of the spacecraft or any material, and it splits it up and creates a cascade of secondary particles, equally as dangerous, called secondary radiation. Hydrogen, you can't split any further. No secondary radiation. So those are the materials they use on the space station. This is a diagram here, for example, in which they strategically place stuff around the water supply around the space station at the moment. But here's a picture of a craft, say, going to Mars, and they have their water supply around the outside. Water is a very good protector. But things like substances rich in carbon, like polyethylene, is the way to go. This here is called the AstroVest. It's just been researched and proven to be very effective. So it's a polymer vest, proprietary vest that a crowd in Israel have made, very rich in hydrogen. It protects all the sensitive organs: breasts, lungs, stomach, bowel, ovaries, bone marrow, the crucial things for health. Protects them. It's been successfully trialled with astronauts on the space station, found to be very effective to put on. They can function with it on. And the idea is they get a call from NASA, there's been a solar event, put your vests on. And the vests provide 90% protection of the vital organs. 90% protection with this vest. So we're going to see more and more of that used. There's another, this is a new material that's been developed over the last 10 to 15 years. It's a real game changer, and it's where they get boron and nitrogen, so boron nitride, and it creates this little hexagonal type of structure into these little nanotubes, very narrow tubes, and they impregnate that with loads of hydrogen. Rich in hydrogen, which you know is very good for protection, and the boron, I go over this in the handout in more detail. Boron is very good at stopping what we call neutrons, which are neutral subatomic particles, which cause even more damage again. I go over that. But this is fantastic. It also ideal properties. It's extremely strong. It's stronger than, say, 50 times carbon fiber or 100 times industrial steel. It's very flexible. It's electrically insulating, so it's going to be good for spacesuits, spacecrafts, space rovers, habitats, and the like. This has been starting to get commercially developed. Remember I mentioned solar maximum, solar minimum, and the sun gets more active. Timing of your launch. When the sun gets more active, okay, it's a problem with increased these solar particle events, but also those particles charging out from the sun deflect a lot of charged particles coming from the rest of the galaxy, so they actually give you some sort of protection. And the computer model suggests that if you launch to Mars 6 months after the peak of the solar activity, you can reduce that's a 2-year flight from 1,000 down to about 500 millisieverts of exposure. So just by timing your trip going to Mars. Developing propulsion systems. Currently we use chemicals for our propulsion. Really great for acceleration and deceleration. Fuel is very heavy and inefficient to be carrying around. When you see a spacecraft launch off the pad like you saw at the beginning of the talk, that 85% of the mass of that whole rocket is fuel to get into orbit. Nuclear, NASA's advanced now with their research on nuclear propulsion. They said they should be trialling it within about 2 years' time. It'll halve the transit time going to Mars. Ion propulsion, that's where you get something like xenon gas and you run electrical current through it, create it into an ion with electric current, shoot it out the back for propulsion. You can look that up, more details on that, but they're already using that. That gets up to fast speeds very, very quickly. So you got that. Probably they'll use a hybrid off the all these technologies are well advanced. Effective monitoring. I don't know what's going on with the screen there, never mind. Monitoring the astronauts, the technology is getting better and better. Astronauts wear little dosimeters, little monitors on themselves 24/7, and they're able to record the amount of exposure. Once again, type of radiation, the dose of radiation, so they're able to have contingency plans. If someone's radiation exposure's got up, they may go down with the next craft, or if you're on the way to Mars, they may wear their vest all the time and so on. So they're aware of each individual astronaut, how much radiation, what type of radiation, and at what rate are they being exposed with their organs. They get that all the time. The other thing is monitoring solar activity. That's becoming a new science, a whole new field in its own right, whereby the scientists are learning to predict the sun. We've seen some surfaces on, they'll communicate with the astronauts. There are some surface features on the sun that look very suspicious that we're going to get a lot of solar activity. Put your vests on, guys. So there's that advancing as well. Monitoring the bio-effects and the biogenetics and stuff. Leukocytes are a type of white blood cell. And they've discovered that the chromosomes within the leukocytes reflect very good indicators of how much biological damage is being done to astronauts, to individuals. So they do that. But here's something really interesting. Not only do those chromosomal changes in the leukocytes tell you the amount of tissue damage, they will tell you an astronaut's individual susceptibility to radiation. So think about that. You get 20 astronauts all queuing up for a 10 astronaut crew to Mars, and you find, say, 10 of them have got a low susceptibility to radiation, say 10 of them might have a high susceptibility. Hey, guess which 10 are going? So that's the future as well. So just wrapping up now. Three prime physical effects: prolonged weightlessness without that pull of gravity, affects the heart, the body fluids, the bones and muscles. Countermeasures comes down to exercise, medications and nutrition. Radiation can cause acute or chronic illness, disease, infertility. Countermeasures, shielding, propulsion technology and monitoring. That technology is all being developed and will be here by 2040. My conclusion is, with advanced research and technology, safe travel will be achieved by 2040. And this is just to show you that space can be a bit of fun. And there you go, they do have some fun up there. And that, my friends, is the hazardous human spaceflight going to Mars. Things we need to know. Thank you very much.